Hello, my name is Sophia. My country I'm reporting on is Brazil. Um, Brazil is a country in South America. It's actually the biggest country in South America. Comparable to the US, it's only slightly smaller. It's the fifth largest country in the world with the fifth largest population. Um, the capital of the country is Brasilia, and it is bordered by the Atlantic Ocean, which gives it about 7,500 kilometers of coastland, and by all the countries in South America except for Argentina and Ecuador. What this means for Brazil is that even though it has not gone to war with any of its neighbors, it is bordered by the world's three biggest producers of cocaine, which are Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru, which makes the influx of drugs a hard thing to control. The borders, being so vast, are hard to patrol because there aren't enough guards, and the large amount of the border that is through the Amazon, through the forests, make it very hard for everyone to control every part of it. Brazil is the only non-Spanish speaking country in South America. It was colonized by the Portuguese, so it's the people speak Portuguese, and it gained its independence in 1822. Following the independence, the Brazilian Empire was established with a monarchy, which was meant to act as a moderating power between the executive, judicial, and legislative branches of government. Toward the end of this time period, Brazil became one of the last countries to abolish slavery, doing so in 1888, 23 years after the United States. After the monarchy ended, it was replaced through a political military coup by a republic the following year in 1889. This republic is known as the Old Republic, and because it was ruled by the elites, things such as popular voting, universal education, and things of that nature were not a priority and therefore not established. From 1930 to 1937, Brazil became a little bit more centralized in their government, and there were different oligarchs in the different regions, most notably Sao Paulo and Minas Gerais. Those oligarchs began to lose power because of the centralization of the government. In 1937, Getulio Vargas became the dictator of Brazil. Under his rule, GDP increased by 4%. The first steel mill was established, pushing the country towards a more industrial economy, and corporatism was introduced. Later on, a democratic election put Eurico Gaspar Dutra in office. Under Dutra, the country saw more improvement in the form of railroads being built and roads connecting Rio to other prominent cities. There were also a lot of rural schools that were established, and the military program was improved and modified. After Dutra, Juscelino Kubitschek was the next democratically elected president, who led the country through as what he called 50 years of progress in 5. He fought for the creation of an automobile industry in Brazil and moved the capital from Rio to Brasilia, which decentralized the population from the coast to the more of like the southeast regions of Brazil. All of his efforts led to an 8.3 annual expansion of the economy, so Brazil saw a prosperous time. In 1985, Sarney became the president, and Brazil suffered hyperinflation. In 1994, the real became Brazil's form of currency, which brought the hyperinflation temporarily to an end. Enrique Cardoso and Luis Inácio Lula da Silva were the next two presidents, and they were charged with corruption in recent years, which I'll talk about later. But in 2010, Dilma Rousseff became the first female president. In 2014 and 2016, the World Cup and the Summer Olympics were hosted in Brazil. These were very controversial because people complained that the money that was spent on building the stadiums and hosting those events could have been spent on alleviating the severe poverty in some regions of Brazil. As far as politics go, as I've kind of alluded to, Brazil has had many different forms of government, from the monarchy to the military-controlled government to a federal republic today. Even though Brazil does identify as having a democratic government, many of its kind of systems have challenged the established democracy. Brazil, the government of Brazil in the past few years has been characterized by corruption. Lula da Silva was implicated, along with a bunch of other politicians, in something called Operation Car Wash. It was a money laundering scheme between the government and the state-owned oil company Petrobras. Basically what happened was people were overpaying the Petrobras-owned construction companies, and the profit that resulted was used to fund politicians and other political parties who had shared interests. So basically a bunch of bribes were paid for people to do as they wanted. Lula was accused of that. Ex-President Lula was accused of that. And then later on, when Dilma Rousseff came into government, she was accused of moving funds between different budgets in order to cover deficits. So she was impeached because of that. And Michel Temer came into office after her. As far as the electoral system goes, they have the candidates that run for the elections are not held accountable. There's an imbalance in apportionment of seats, and the huge size of the districts tend to cause a very small accountability for the candidates. Yeah. As far as the economy goes, Brazil does have a capitalist economy like the United States, but it has suffered from high inflation and a very recent recession in 2015 and 2016. During the recession, unemployment reached nearly 12%. In addition, because of the high inflation, investments into certain sectors of the country and foreign investments have not really been encouraged or common. And then over the past 16 years, the average inflation was about 9% a year, which is a huge improvement over the inflation that Brazil saw beginning in 1980s. Like I said before, the URV, which was the unit of real value, was created as like a virtual currency. And when people began thinking in the URVs, the old currency got replaced with the real. The economy of Brazil is primarily made up of services, so telecommunications and internet and things of that nature, and manufacturing, so automobiles, petrochemicals, machinery, textiles. Agriculture has represented a smaller and smaller percent of Brazil's economy, and only represents 5.4% of the economy today. As far as gender issues go in Brazil, there are a lot of issues with slavery and prostitution. So in Brazil, prostitution is legal, but brothels and pimps, or like people pimping girls, is illegal. Even though prostitution is legal, you have to be 18. But because of the poverty that many of the people see, many of the girls are on the streets well before they turn 18. When the Olympic Games came to Brazil, there were a lot of problems with human trafficking and prostitution. One thing that Brazil has seen a lot of is child trafficking and children held as sex slaves. There's a road called the Highway of Death, which basically is a 2,800-mile stretch of road connecting Fortaleza, which is where the Olympics were held, and Sao Paulo. And along this road, there's a bunch of shanty towns that have a very poor population of people. These people tend to there are a lot of cases where these people sell their children to the truck drivers that drive through in order to make some money. Violence towards women in Brazil is very high. There's issues with family violence and homicides, female homicides in Brazil. According to a report from Mapa de Violencia, which is a nonprofit that nonprofit that tracks violent crimes in Brazil, a woman is killed every 2 hours and assaulted every 15 seconds, usually by someone she knows. This is a very unfortunate statistic, and despite certain laws that have been put in place, Brazil hasn't seen very many improvements. The number of women killed annually has actually been increasing from a 1,300 number of female deaths in 1980 to over 4,500 deaths annually in 2013. In 2014, Brazil did amend its constitution and added clauses that stated that the state will put an effort to suppress violence within the family, and the penal code was amended to increase prison sentences and the severity of punishments for perpetrators of any sexual violence. Unfortunately, these haven't really helped in decreasing the high death rates of females and the abuse and the violence that Brazil's women see. As far as fertility rates in Brazil, there has been a dramatic decrease from an average of 6 children to an average of less than 2. In comparison, the fertility rate of the United States is 1.8 and that of the world is 2.5. The decrease in fertility was really unexpected because of the diversity of Brazil's population. Brazil has a very diverse population ethnically and also socioeconomically. One issue that Brazil is seeing a lot of is the issue of abortion. There is an amendment to the Constitution called PEC 181, which is set to make abortions illegal. It's currently being debated, but many women have gone to protest because if someone wants to get rid of an unwanted pregnancy, they're going to find abortions anyway. Brazil has a huge problem with unsafe abortions, with one woman who, on average, will die every 2 days from an unsafe abortion. One other thing that Brazil has seen is the Zika emergency. Although Zika is not so much an emergency anymore, there were about 2,400 children that have already been born with microcephaly, which is a condition that is caused by Zika. One other thing I want to talk about is the poverty in Brazil. The 9% of Brazilians, so about 18 million people, live below the national poverty line in Brazil, and another 10 million fall below the international poverty line. This is a huge problem because these people live in what are called favelas, so kind of shanty towns that are very unsafe. They're typically controlled by gangs, and even the police don't venture into these areas. The residents are typically safe from the gang violence, but between the different favelas, there's intergang conflicts that puts a lot of people into danger. Yeah. There are a variety of humanitarian groups in Brazil that are helping. One is the Brazil Foundation, which has helped over 500 organizations and has helped bridge the gap between donors and the organizations that they want to help in Brazil. Other specific ones include the IDD, which is the Institute of Defense of Rights. This organization's goal is to protect people's rights and to make sure everyone is getting a fair trial and things of that nature. So that is my report on Brazil. Thanks for listening.